Hi folks, Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. This lesson is on monopsony. As we continue to work through Unit 5 in micro, the resource market, resources, aka factors of production. I want to clarify some terms that we're using this unit in terms of how we name factor prices, which are also known as factor payments. In a free market system, individuals own the factors of production. Households of individuals own the land, the labor, the capital, own the entrepreneurship, and they receive payments from firms for those factors. When, the payment for land is called rent. The payment for labor is called the wage. The payment for capital, it comes in the form of interest. So individuals have savings that they put in banks that is then loaned out to firms to borrow money to buy machines, factories, and tools. And the interest payments on those loans paid by firms ends up in the form of interest payments to households. We'll talk a lot more about that in macro. And then entrepreneurs are paid for their skills and creativity and risk taking in the form of profit. So comparing this to the product market, whereas in the product market, individuals paid businesses for goods and services, here in the resource market, aka the factor market, businesses are paying individuals for the use of those resources. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the types of resource markets. There are two types of resource markets. Compare this to the product market. There were 4 types of product markets. There are only 2 types of resource markets. What is a monopsony? Well, it's essentially the resource market version of a monopoly, meaning there's only one firm. And that one firm is going to be hiring workers. And because that firm is so large, they are going to be able to manipulate the market. Contrast this with perfect competition. We had hundreds or even thousands of identical firms that didn't have that much market share, so they could not control the wage. And any changes that they made did not affect the whole market. However, in a monopsony, the firm is so dominant, they can manipulate the wage in the market. Workers in the monopsony model are going to be relatively immobile. So they're not going to have much ability to pick up and move for new opportunities. Therefore, the firm is the wage maker. The firm is going to be able to set the wage. And if they want to hire more workers, they're going to have to raise the wage. Okay, so as wage makers, they can set the wage. The more workers they need, the higher they're going to have to set the wage in order to attract those workers. Examples of monopsonies could be like a manufacturing or factory town somewhere in Central America. This is a common model for this, or in the Midwest United States, sometimes if there's one large car plant. As we move into the 21st century, there's other interesting examples that are emerging of this, but these are sort of the classic examples of this model. So let's take a look at a coal mining plant and imagine that it has monopolistic power. Imagine that it cannot wage discriminate and it must pay each worker the same wage. There's no wage discrimination in monopsonies. We're only going to look at paying everyone the same wage. So take a look at this chart. We have a possibility of different wage rates we can pay individual workers. And you can see that as the wage increases, so too does the number of workers. So as these workers consider their trade-offs between leisure and working, the higher the wage, the more incentive they have to come to work for Olson Mining Co. And what we're going to analyze now is what's the marginal resource cost? What's the additional cost of hiring one more worker? Okay, and I want you to pay attention to this. The big takeaway is the marginal resource cost does not equal the wage. Let's analyze why. Well, if we only pay $4 in our Olson Mining Co., we're not going to attract any workers, so the marginal resource cost would be 0. If we raise the wage to $4.50, we could attract 1 worker, and the marginal resource cost of that 1 worker would be $4.50. So far, so good. However, if we want to get more workers into our company, we're going to have to raise the wage to $5. Then we could attract 2 workers. And if that's the case, even though the wage is $5, we would have to pay that first worker 50 more cents on top of paying 50 more cents to the second worker to get him or her to $5. What does that mean? The marginal resource cost of the second worker is actually $5.50. The wage is only $5, but the marginal resource cost is 550. Why? We have to pay that first worker an extra 50 cents. And you can see the divergence between the MRC and the wage as we continue to increase the wage, because in order to hire more workers, we have to hire the wage of everyone else, including those who we could have paid a lower wage. This logic is exactly the same as a monopoly in the product market, but it's flipped here in the resource market. Another column that may be helpful for you to think through this is the total resource cost, which is simply the total amount of wages that we're paying out. With my beautiful calligraphy over here, again, I teach calligraphy in summer school. Sign up if you want to get some extra work. We can kind of do a total resource cost here. And all you would do is multiply the wage times the quantity of workers, right? So it would be 450 here, and then 2 times 5 is 10, and then 3 times 550 is 1650, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the change in the total resource cost is equal to the marginal resource cost. So sometimes that helps you see why the marginal resource cost is diverging, right? So you can see here 450, and we go from 450 to 10, and that's a difference of 550, which is the marginal resource cost of that second worker. All right, so takeaway from this slide is, for monopsonies, the MRC does not equal the supply of labor, and therefore the MRC does not equal the wage, right? You can contrast that with the MRC that we faced when we were looking at firms in perfectly competitive labor markets. Because they were taking the wage from the market, we had a perfectly horizontal supply of labor for an individual firm, which was their marginal resource cost. And now that we're in a monopsonies, this situation no longer exists, and the MRC does not equal the supply. So what does this look like when we graph it? Take a look at this monopsony. We're drawing the firm and the market, because in a monopsony, the firm is the market. We have the wage, which could also be the rent for land or any other resource here on the vertical. And then we have, of course, the quantity of labor, in this case on the horizontal, which is the employment in this industry. We have a downward sloping demand of labor curve for this monopsony, which is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. And it's downward sloping because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. And then we have an upward sloping supply of labor curve. It's upward sloping because we are wage makers. And you can see that the law of supply holds for this particular supply of labor curve. If we raise the wage, then the quantity of labor supplied increase. So what I want you to try to predict on this graph then is, if that's our supply of labor curve and we can't wage discriminate, where is the MRC curve going to be? So you can go back, if you want to that last table and take a look at where the MRC is in relationship to the wage, right? Because this is giving us the different wages, and predict where our MRC is going to be on this graph, and it would be right here. The MRC is higher than the supply of labor curve, and it's diverging. In fact, it's rising twice as fast as the supply of labor curve. All right, now that we've given this, now that we've drawn this graph, the next question is, for this monopsony, for this small town firm hiring workers, what is going to be the quantity of workers and what is going to be the wage that they charge? Like all firms, they want to profit maximize in the resource market by hiring where MRP equals MRC. That rule still applies. As monopsonies, we're going to look for the quantity where MRC equals MRP, which is going to be right here. Okay. Next question is, at that QE, okay, what are we going to pay those workers? What's going to be the wage that we're going to set? Common mistake on this is students would dot over here where MRC equals MRP. However, that's not the case, because the MRC is not the wage. The supply of labor is the wage. And as a monopsonist, we get to pay a lower wage. So you go down to the supply of labor curve and then dot that over to give us the wage equilibrium. So as you can see here, we're going to hire at the quantity where where MRC equals MRP, and then we're going to go down the supply of labor curve to figure out the wage that we're going to charge. This is how a monopsony chooses to profit maximize. And what you can see is, compared to a perfectly competitive labor market, they hire fewer workers and they pay a lower wage. This should sound familiar, kind of how in the product market, a monopoly underproduces and overcharges. A monopsony underhires, and underpays. So let's see if you're getting it. Go ahead and pause the video, read this question, and see if you can figure out what the wage and quantity of labor would be for this monopsony. Correct answer is a wage of $15 at a quantity of Q2. How would you find that? First step, you look for where MRP equals MRC, and that's where we could profit maximize. We want to keep hiring workers. Quantity one is wrong because the revenue brought in by that worker is way more than the marginal resource cost of hiring that worker. As these two lines converge, when they meet, we're going to profit maximize because that's where our marginal resource cost is equal to our marginal revenue product of labor. And you can see that that is down here at Q2. Common mistake, students would say, oh, they're going to pay them 22 bucks. No, we get to go down to the supply of labor curve and then dot that over to find a wage of $15. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how monopsonies work and how we determine how much they pay and how many workers they hire. Okay. Final slide I want to show you is this one. I want you to compare the graphs of the monopoly and the monopsony. We're building off of our knowledge from the product market, and I want you to see that the monopsony is the inverse or the sort of flipped image here of a monopoly. Take a look at this. On the bottom, we see the monopoly gang sign, where the marginal revenue curve is lower than the demand. And if you sort of flip that up, you flip up your monopoly gang sign, then you can see that the MRC up here is greater than the supply of labor curve. We could also compare these to their perfectly competitive alternatives, right? Let's just talk about monopsony here. If this was a perfectly competitive labor market, then we would be producing in the industry at this wage and at this quantity. And you can see that our wage is lower as a monopsonist and our quantity is lower as a monopsonist. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.